The ballroom was a masterpiece of warm amber lights, expensive perfume, and the gentle clinking of crystal glasses. Soft jazz hummed in the background, weaving through conversations that were as smooth as the silk gowns in the room. Maya stood near the service bar, an unnoticed guest in a simple dress, blending into the shadows. Everything looked perfect, perhaps a little too perfect. While the crowd laughed and celebrated, Maya's eyes locked onto a man across the room. It didn't look wrong, but it didn't feel right either. She watched him for 3 seconds too long. Something was about to break the silence. What was it? The gala was a high-profile fundraiser for the city's arts program. It was the kind of event where the air felt expensive, filled with the soft rustle of designer fabrics and the rhythmic, practiced laughter of people who were used to being seen. The Grand Hall was a sanctuary of elegance, far removed from the sterile, white-tiled reality of the Metropolitan Hospital where Maya spent her 40-hour weeks. To her, the hospital was a place of raw truth, where life stripped away the pretenses of wealth and status. Here in the ballroom, those pretenses were thicker than the velvet curtains. Maya was there as a +1 for a friend, a junior administrator who was desperate to network and climb the corporate ladder. To the elite circle in the center of the room, Maya was invisible, just another face in a crowd of 300. She didn't have a title that commanded attention, and she wasn't wearing jewelry that cost more than a suburban house. She was content to stand by the side, sipping sparkling water and watching the human theater unfold with a detached curiosity. But even in a silk dress, Maya was a nurse. It wasn't just a job, it was a lens through which she viewed the world. It was a permanent physiological shift in how her brain processed movement and sound. While others saw a CEO making a grand entrance, Maya saw a man with a slightly irregular, guarded gait. While others heard a politician's booming voice, she heard a breathy quality that suggested hidden fatigue or an underlying cardiac strain. It was an involuntary habit, a professional instinct that looked for the small wrongs beneath the grand rites. She couldn't turn it off any more than she could stop her own heart from beating. She leaned against a marble pillar, her head slightly tilted, a classic signal of deep analytical attention. She wasn't scrolling through her phone to pass the time. She was scanning the room with a cold, focused intensity that most people would find unsettling if they bothered to look in her direction. She was cataloging breathing rates, skin tones, and the way people held their muscle tension. In the center of a lively circle stood Julian, a well-known philanthropist and the star of the evening. He was charming, holding a glass of expensive champagne in one hand and gesturing animatedly with the other. He was telling a story, and the people around him were hanging on every word, laughing at his well-timed jokes. To anyone else, Julian was the life of the party, a man at the peak of his power. But Maya's eyes remained fixed on Julian's jawline. She noticed that every time he smiled, the left side of his face didn't quite match the right. It was a deviation of less than a millimeter, a ghost of a lag that appeared only for a split second. She watched the way he took a sip of his drink. He didn't just swallow. He tilted his head back in a specific, awkward way that suggested his throat muscles weren't coordinating perfectly with his tongue. It was a minute struggle for control that no one else in the room was trained to see. Then there was the breathing. Julian was laughing, but his chest was moving in short, shallow bursts that didn't sync with the rhythm of his speech. He was compensating for something his body wasn't getting enough of. He was working incredibly hard to appear normal, and he was doing a brilliant, almost heroic job of it. He was a man fighting a private battle in the middle of a spotlight. The internal conflict began to stir in Maya's chest. Am I just being paranoid? She wondered, her hand tightening around her glass. I just finished a grueling double shift. Maybe I'm seeing ghosts where there are only tired, wealthy people. She watched her friend Sarah, who was laughing nearby with a group of donors. Sarah was having the time of her life, blissfully unaware of the biological drama happening just 10 feet away. Maya felt the urge to just be like Sarah, to turn off her brain, enjoy the jazz, and ignore the tiny, nagging whisper of her intuition. But then Julian reached for a napkin on the table. His hand moved with a slight, jerky hesitation, a micro tremor that was covered up by a quick, smooth correction. It was a masterpiece of self-control, But to Maya, it was a flashing red light. Maya realized that Julian wasn't just tired or stressed. He was in a state of high alert, his nervous system fighting a battle against its own internal failure. In the medical world, we are often taught to look for the big bad, the collapse, the scream, the sudden visible blood. But Maya knew that the most dangerous things usually start with a whisper. They start with a smile that doesn't reach the eyes and a breath that doesn't quite reach the bottom of the lungs. The silence before the storm is always the most telling part of the story. She took a slow, grounding breath of her own. She was an outsider in this room, a guest with no authority and no badge to protect her. If she stepped in and was wrong, she would ruin a perfect night for her friend and embarrass a powerful, influential man. But if she was right, the night was about to turn from elegant to tragic in a matter of minutes. Maya decided that she would rather be the strange girl who overreacted than the nurse who watched a man walk into a crisis and did nothing. The jazz band shifted into a slower, more melodic tune, the saxophone notes trailing through the air like silk. The room began to dim slightly as the keynote presentation approached, and the spotlights were readied. Maya moved away from her pillar, weaving through the crowd with the quiet, determined pace she used when navigating a crowded trauma bay during a crisis. She didn't rush. She didn't want to draw unnecessary eyes or create a scene before she was certain. She positioned herself near the appetizer table, only a few feet from Julian's lively circle. Up close, the signals weren't just whispers anymore. They were shouting. Julian was still talking, but his words were coming out in a slightly clipped, staccato fashion. He was sacrificing vowels to save air, a classic sign of respiratory distress. His skin, which had looked flushed and healthy from across the room, now looked waxy and pale under the direct light of the crystal chandelier. A single tiny bead of sweat had formed on his temple, despite the cool, climate-controlled air of the hall. He was leaking stress from every pore. He was holding a fresh glass of wine. Maya watched his fingers. His grip was far too tight, a death grip used to mask the fact that his fine motor skills were beginning to fail him. He was anchoring himself to the stem of the glass. "Julian, you're always so full of energy. How do you do it?" a woman in the circle exclaimed, completely oblivious to his state. I try, Julian replied. The I was a half-beat late, a tiny neurological hesitation that vibrated through Maya's nerves. Maya looked around the room. The servers were gliding by with silver trays. The security guards were standing by the heavy doors, looking for threats from the outside world. No one was looking for the threat growing from within. Everyone was socially conditioned to believe that if a person is standing, smiling and talking, they are fine. We trust the mask more than the face. The tension inside Maya was reaching a breaking point. Her heart was drumming against her ribs. One more minute, she told herself. I'll wait for one more clear, undeniable sign before I interrupt this man's life. That sign came when Julian tried to shift his weight to address someone on his left. He intended to move his left foot forward to maintain his balance, but the foot didn't lift. It dragged, just for a fraction of a second, against the thick, plush carpet. It was a sound no one else heard over the jazz and the laughter, but to Maya it was as loud and clear as a gunshot in a library. It was the sound of a system shutting down. She didn't hesitate anymore. She stepped directly into the circle, breaking the social barrier. The conversation faltered instantly. The people around Julian looked at her with polite confusion, their eyes taking in her simple dress and her lack of social standing. They saw an interloper. Julian himself looked at her, his expression a mix of guarded curiosity and a growing hidden fear that he could no longer suppress. "Excuse me," Maya said. Her voice was a low, steady frequency, the kind of voice that demands attention without ever needing to raise its volume. "I'm so sorry to interrupt this conversation. Mr. Julian, I'm a nurse. I've been watching you from the bar, and I'm a bit concerned about your breathing and the way you're holding your glass." A few people in the circle chuckled nervously, thinking she was a fan or perhaps a little too intoxicated. One man stepped forward looking annoyed and protective. "I think he's doing just fine, miss. He's been the life of the party all night. Why don't you head back to the bar?" "Are you okay?" Maya asked Julian directly, ignoring the others as if they weren't even there. She looked straight into his eyes, searching for pupillary response. Julian tried to give his trademark million-dollar smile, but the left side of his lip remained stagnant, refusing to obey. I'm perfectly fine, he said. His voice was thin and brittle, like old paper being torn. Just a bit of a long week. Too many meetings. The gaps between his words were far too long. He was pausing for air in the middle of a simple 5-word sentence. He was drowning in the air of the ballroom. May I just check your pulse? Maya asked, stepping closer into his personal space. Julian's eyes widened, the pupils dilating with a sudden, primal realization. For the first time that night, the mask of the philanthropist dropped, and the vulnerability of the patient emerged. He knew. Deep down in his lizard brain, he knew he was slipping away. He reached out his hand toward her, and as he did, the wine glass tipped precariously. Maya caught the glass with practiced ease before it could hit the floor. She placed it on the nearest table and took his wrist in her hand. His pulse was thready, fast, and irregular, a gallop rhythm that suggested his heart was trying to outrun a problem it couldn't see. His skin was cold and clammy to the touch, a sharp, chilling contrast to the warmth of the room. He was in the early stages of shock. "Mr. Julian," she said softly, leaning in so only he could hear her voice above the jazz. "We need to sit you down, right now. Don't try to walk any further. Just let me guide you to the chair behind you. I have to give the speech," Julian whispered, his eyes searching the room for the podium. "The speech can wait," Maya replied, her voice gaining that clinical edge that left no room for debate or social niceties. "Your health cannot wait another second." The people in the circle were now starting to realize that this wasn't a social gaffe or an awkward fan interaction. The silence was spreading through the crowd like a cold wave. Sarah, Maya's friend, finally saw the scene and rushed over, her face pale with worry. "Maya? What's going on? Is he all right?" "Help me get him to that lounge chair, Sarah," Maya commanded, already shifting her weight to support Julian. The transition from social event to medical intervention was happening in real time. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic or chaotic. It was a quiet, controlled shift of power. The girl in the simple dress was now the most important person in the room, and the philanthropist was now the person who needed her more than anyone else in the world. The silk gowns and crystal glasses were now just background noise to the reality of survival. Maya and Sarah guided Julian to a deep velvet armchair in a quiet, dimly lit corner of the hall. The circle of guests followed at a distance, their faces a mixture of genuine concern and morbid curiosity. Maya didn't want a crowd. A crowd creates heat, consumes oxygen, and breeds panic. She needed a controlled environment to work. "Everyone, please," Maya said, not looking up from Julian's face. "Give us some space. Sarah, find a staff member immediately. Tell them we need the on-site medical kit and a quiet room with a door. Don't call 911 just yet, but tell the EMTs on standby to come to the north corner right now." The authority in Maya's voice was absolute and undeniable. People who had ignored her all night were now moving at her command without a second thought. The jazz band noticed the shift in the room's energy and lowered their volume even further, the music becoming a haunting, low-frequency hum that seemed to match the gravity of the moment. Maya knelt on the floor in front of Julian, her dress pulling around her. She was no longer a guest. She was an ICU nurse in her element, her mind already running through a diagnostic checklist. "Julian, look at me," she said, her voice an anchor. "Don't look at the crowd. Just focus on my eyes. Keep your breathing slow and steady. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. You're doing great." Julian was leaning back, his head lolling slightly, his eyes beginning to roll upward. The grade 1 signals she had seen from across the room were now grade 3. His facial droop was now obvious to everyone, even the most untrained observer. "He's having a stroke," someone in the back of the crowd whispered, their voice laced with rising panic. "He is having a neurological event," Maya corrected firmly, her voice loud enough to calm the surrounding room. "But we are managing it. Panic is the only thing that will make this worse. Please move back and give him air." The on-site EMTs arrived a minute later, carrying a heavy orange response bag. They were 2 young men, prepared for a simple faint or a cut finger at a fancy party. They saw Maya on the floor in Julian's deteriorating condition, and they hesitated, overwhelmed by the profile of the patient. "What have we got?" the lead EMT asked, his voice shaking slightly. Maya gave the report, the clinical shorthand that signaled she was one of them, a peer who knew the language of the field. Male, 58, Julian, noted left side facial asymmetry and respiratory lag 12 minutes ago. Progressive left side weakness. Heart rate is 112 and irregular. Skin is cool and diaphoretic. I've been keeping him conscious and focused on breath control. No history of recent trauma, but he's on blood thinners. The EMTs nodded, their eyes showing a flash of sudden respect. They didn't try to push her away. They moved in around her, but they looked to her for the rhythm and the direction of the intervention. She was the captain of this tiny ship in a storm. "Julian," Maya said, holding his hand firmly, "the EMTs are here now. We're going to move you to a quieter room to get a better look and start some fluids. You're doing great. Stay with me, okay?" They lifted him onto a portable gurney with a coordinated motion. As they moved him toward the service exit, the ballroom was suddenly, unnervingly silent. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The laughter was gone. The room was no longer a ballroom. It was a witness to the profound fragility of life. The expensive perfume now smelled like copper and sweat. One of the organizers, a man in a tuxedo who looked ready to faint himself, approached Maya as she stood up. Is he going to be okay? He's the heart of this foundation." Maya took a deep, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally starting to recede, replaced by a deep, familiar exhaustion. "We caught it early," she said, wiping a stray hair from her face. "If he had tried to give that speech, if he had stood under those hot stage lights for another 20 minutes, pushing himself to be perfect, it would have been a very different story. He needed someone to notice the whisper before his body started to scream." "I didn't even see a single thing," the man admitted, shaking his head in disbelief. "He looked so happy and healthy when he walked in." "He was happy," as Maya said softly, "but he was also very sick. The body is very good at lying to the world, especially when the world expects a show, but it's not very good at lying to itself. It just needed someone to stop and listen to the truth." This was the awareness moment for everyone watching. The soft twist of the night wasn't that Julian had a rare or exotic disease. It was that his life was saved by the simplest and most accessible tool in the world: attention. Maya hadn't used a high-tech scanner or a specialized drug. She had used her eyes, her ears, and her immense patience. She had seen the person behind the philanthropist. The EMTs loaded Julian into the ambulance waiting in the cool night air. Before the doors closed, Maya stepped up to the edge of the vehicle. Julian was on supplemental oxygen now, his color already starting to return to his cheeks. He looked at Maya through the mask. He couldn't speak well, but he gave a small, weak, but intentional squeeze of her hand. It was the only thank you she would ever need. It was the silent recognition of one human being saving another. The ambulance pulled away, its lights silent but bright in the dark street. Maya stood on the sidewalk for a long time, the sounds of the party drifting out from the open doors behind her. The jazz had started up again, but it sounded different now, more fragile, more precious, more real. Sarah came out and stood next to her, handing her a coat. "You were amazing, Maya. I had no idea you were even looking at him. I was just thinking about the appetizers and the music. It's easy to miss things when you're looking at the show," Maya said softly, her voice blending with the wind. "But the real story is always happening in the shadows. You just have to decide that the shadows are worth watching." The viewers of this story realized that the dangerous night wasn't stopped by a hero in a cape or a billionaire with a plan. It was stopped by a woman who refused to ignore the small off. It was stopped by the realization that we are all responsible for the silence and the signals around us. Every life is a series of whispers, waiting for someone to listen. Maya didn't go back inside the ballroom. She couldn't. The mask of the party had been broken for her, and all she wanted was the honest silence of her own home. But the ripple of her actions was already moving through the guests. Inside, the atmosphere had permanently shifted. People weren't just talking, they were looking at each other. They were noticing the person next to them in a way they hadn't an hour before. The Maya effect was a subtle increase in collective awareness. A week later, Maya was back at the hospital, wearing her blue scrubs and her ID badge. She was doing her rounds in the cardiac unit when a woman approached her. It was the lady with the knitting bag from the lobby, referencing a previous story or a similar character type for continuity of the watcher. "Nurse Maya?" the woman asked. "Yes. I heard what you did at the gala. My daughter was there. She told me how you just stepped in. She said you didn't even look like you were trying to be a hero. You were just being a nurse." Maya smiled. "That's the best compliment I've ever received." The hospital administration didn't give her a medal. The newspapers didn't write a story about the gala savior. Julian's family sent a very quiet, very sincere note of thanks. But that was it. There was no public honor, and Maya preferred it that way. The soft recognition came in smaller ways. Her colleagues started asking her more questions. "Maya, what do you think of the breathing in room 12? Maya, does this EKG look off to you, even though the computer says it's normal?" She had become the watcher of the whispers. One afternoon, a young intern was rushing to discharge a patient. Maya was sitting at the nursing station, recording her logs. She looked at the patient walking toward the elevator. "Wait," Maya said. The intern stopped. "He's cleared, Maya. Labs are good. Mobility is stable." "Look at his left hand," Maya said. "He's carrying his bag, but his thumb is tucked into his palm. He wasn't doing that 10 minutes ago." The intern looked. He realized Maya was right. They brought the patient back. It was the early sign of a post-op complication that would have turned dangerous by the time the man reached his car. "How do you do that?" the intern asked, his eyes wide. "I don't look at the everything," Maya said. "I just look at the thing that doesn't belong. If you can find the outlier, you can find the truth." This is the real one-move impact. Maya hadn't just saved Julian. She had taught a dozen other people how to see. She had shown them that professionalism isn't just about following the protocol. It's about being present enough to realize when the protocol isn't enough. The dangerous night at the gala had become a legend in the hospital, not as a story of drama, but as a lesson in the power of the quiet observer. Maya went back to her work, her eyes always moving, always scanning, always listening for the next whisper. Because in a world that is always rushing toward the next big thing, Maya knew that the most important thing is often the small off that everyone else is too busy to see. The story of the nurse at the gala is a mirror for our own lives, especially in an age of digital noise and social performance. We live in a world of surface perfection. We post the best versions of our lives. We wear the best masks to our jobs. We tell everyone we are fine because we don't want to be a burden or a small wrong in a room full of grand rites. But Maya reminds us that the off feeling is the most valuable signal we have. It is the intuition that tells you a friend is struggling even when they are laughing. It is the instinct that tells you a project is failing even when the spreadsheet looks green. It is the quiet voice that says, "Wait," when the rest of the world is saying, "Go." How many times have you noticed something off but stayed silent? How many times have you seen a small wrong in your community, your workplace, or your family and decided to ignore it because you didn't want to break the silk silence of the room? We fear being the one who disrupts the music. We fear being the outlier. But as Maya showed us, the outlier is the only one who can see the truth. Impact doesn't have to be loud. In fact, the most profound changes often happen in total silence. In the decision to look at a jawline, the decision to catch a wine glass, and the decision to value a human life over a social protocol. Maya's superpower wasn't her medical training. It was her attention. It was her refusal to let the beauty of the ballroom drown out the reality of the body. In your own life, try to be Maya. Try to be the one who looks past the lights and the music. Try to be the one who listens to the whispers. Don't be afraid to say, "Are you okay?" Don't be afraid to ask for a pause. Don't be afraid to be the one who notices. The ballroom is still there. The jazz is still playing. The crystal is still clinking. But if you look closely in the corner, you might see someone standing quietly, watching the room with a look of absolute, unwavering peace. They aren't looking at the show. They are looking at you. And because they are looking, the night is a little safer than it was before. One move, total silence, And a world changed because one person dared to notice what everyone else chose to ignore. What will you notice today? What whisper will you finally hear? The silence is waiting for you to listen. Will you be the one to hear it?